Alright guys, Murph's here, and today we're going to talk about the .30 Carbine Cartridge. Now, before we get into this, I do want to go ahead and cover a couple of little caveats. So, for some reason, hi Peppercorn, for some reason, my mind keeps glitching out, and it keeps wanting to say M1 Carbine anytime I'm talking about the .30 Carbine. Probably because the M1 Carbine is the most prolific weapon system to be chambered in this particular cartridge, with 6 million produced. However, we are specifically talking about the cartridge. If you want a review of the rifle, I do have a video on my M1 Carbine. I'll go ahead and throw the link in the description. Now, the only time we're going to talk about weapon systems used with this cartridge, the M1 Carbine specifically, as well as the development of the M1 Carbine, is wherever it intersects with the overall conversation about the cartridge itself. So, with that being the case, let's go ahead and roll into our discussion today, where we're going to cover some history, a little bit of the pros and cons, do a little bit of comparison, and then summarize it all up with my own personal thoughts based off the information presented. So, in 1940, the United States military recognized that it had a gap, and that was specifically that infantry tactics and capabilities had advanced quite significantly since the First World War. So now there was not just 4 categories of personnel that required rifles. Specifically, that being infantry, cavalry, engineers, and cannon crews. There were a lot more people with specialized tasks already carrying heavy things on the battlefield that needed lighter overall weapon systems. So now we've got mortarmen fragged out down to the company and platoon level. We have radio operators, the ability to be able to carry a radio on your back and be able to maintain communications, bazooka men, all that kind of stuff, anti-tank capabilities, all the way down to frontline duties. And for those guys already carrying heavy things and the additional equipment required to be able to operate those heavy things, don't necessarily need to carry an 8 to 10 pound rifle. Now, it's 1940, so we're in the process of switching out the 1903 Springfield for the M1 Garand, but it's not yet complete. And both of these concepts are indicative of the short rifle concept, with which I've discussed ad nauseum, and I don't really want to get into it again, other than to say that that was fantastic when infantry were just doing rifleman things, maybe had machine gun platoons attached to them, and then, everyone else had their jobs. That made it fine to be able to work around the rifle, especially when you're talking about engineers and artillerymen. When they were conducting their duties, they were stacking the rifles and then having their hands free to conduct the duties. And infantrymen with a mortar tube cannot necessarily do the same thing. He still needs access to his weapon system readily in case of attack. He's on the front line. There's a pretty high probability he's going to be attacked. Now, in addition to that, you have rear echelon troops who are armed primarily with 1911s at this point. And in a world where it is unlikely that the front line is all of a sudden going to extend and pop up in the middle of the rear echelon, that's completely fine. At least they still have some kind of weapon in worst case scenarios, the capability to be able to defend themselves on the battlefield. But there's no real expectation that they'll do it. However, by 1940, we've now seen Blitzkrieg in all of its glory, and understood that a fully mechanized military can penetrate deep into enemy lines in a single attack, and all of a sudden that rear echelon might find themselves being the front line. Now, of course, rear echelon troops are not going to be able to go toe-to-toe with actual dedicated combat troops for any length of time, but to be able to hang on to something long enough, they're going to need something better than a 1911, especially if they're facing a German infantry platoon with supporting MG42s. You're not going to be taking out MG42s with a 1911. This is not Call of Duty. This is not reality. So, with that being the case, something needs to be done. Now, in the past, carbines would be supplied to troops who needed to be maybe a little bit more mobile, or perhaps had a different task to perform on the battlefield. And carbines at this time would just be a cut-down service rifle, more or less. It would still fire a full-power rifle cartridge, and there would be accompanying muzzle flash and blast, as well as recoil associated with that, which is not fantastic for somebody that you're actually expecting to have to fight with this rifle. That's just fine for somebody that you're like, look dude, maybe you'll empty a magazine at the most, but your primary purpose is to get out of dodge, and this rifle will help you do that. For a bazooka man, that's not really an option at that point. So what the United States military would decide to do was put out a requirement for a lightweight weapon system, something half the weight of an M1 Garand, firing a purpose-built cartridge for it. And for this cartridge, they would actually go to Winchester and they would give their requirements. They would want something a minimum of 27 caliber, meeting a 2,000 feet per second threshold, and being capable of being utilized, with a semi-automatic rifle. And they would also want it to be able to reach out to 300 yards, all this kind of stuff. Winchester would take this project and hand it over to a fellow named Pugsley, whose first name I have regrettably forgotten. However, he would take a look at the 32 Winchester self-loading cartridge, and he would decide to put it on a little bit of a diet and get rid of its rimmed cartridge casing. And what he would develop would be a 110 grain round nose bullet seated in a slightly tapered but mostly straight walled cartridge with a rimless case head, moving at just under 2,000 feet per second. Now, just to real quick, put this thing into context, I'll go ahead and roll in a picture of the 30 carbine in comparison to some others. So on the left is a 5.56. In the center is the 30 carbine, or the 7.62 by 63, and to the right is an 8mm Kurtz. Now, the Army would take a look at this, they play around with it a little bit, and they would decide, yes, we like it, we're going to go forward with this. And then they would launch the M1 carbine trials, where they would actually hold that cartridge close to the chest. They wouldn't tell those entering into the trials what cartridge it was that they were building the rifles for. They would put out the requirements for what they were looking for. Quite a few of the manufacturers missed the mark on that, and then they unveiled the cartridge, gave the manufacturers time to go back and adjust their weapon systems, tune them for the 30 carbine cartridge, which apparently was actually quite difficult. I'm not entirely sure why, because I'm not an engineer by any means, but from what I understand, it had something to do with the pressure profile of the 30 carbine cartridge, as far as trying to figure out where to put the gas port in relation to the peak pressures generated by the cartridge. There's a lot of stuff that goes into that, as far as port distance as well as size, and that is versus, how far travel has to go and how much gas it actually takes to be able to operate the system and all that kind of thing, consistency in the cartridge. And at this time, guys, keep in mind that semi-automatic rifles of a gas-operated variety are still very new, especially when we're talking about gas ports and all that kind of stuff. The M1 Garand has just recently transitioned over to a gas port. Previously, it was running off of a gas trap system. So it's not too surprising that people would have some issue with trying to figure out how to tune gas systems for different cartridges and all that kind of stuff. Now, by 1942, cartridge and rifle would be out in the field, and this cartridge would serve throughout the remainder of World War II, in and through Korea, and all the way up into Vietnam. Now, after Vietnam, or during Vietnam, it would finally make its way out of service, and then eventually it would make its way onto the commercial market, where actually some other weapon systems would be developed for it. Magnum Research would eventually make a revolver chambered in the 30 carbine. Ruger produced the Black Hawk in 30 carbine. And also AMT produced their Automag semi-automatic pistol in 30 carbine, which I actually find really interesting. Thompson Contender would also produce pistols and rifles in that same caliber. And that pretty much brings us here to today. Now, let's go ahead and talk about a couple of different things with the 30 carbine cartridge. Did the Army actually succeed in meeting their requirements with this? Well, let's go ahead and roll in a chart. We can kind of talk about the overall performance parameters of the 30 carbine itself. So as we can see, from 200 to 300 yards, there's a pretty distinct drop in the bullet speed overall and velocity overall. At the muzzle, we have that just under 2,000 feet per second, and also generating 960 foot-pounds of energy, which is very interesting, especially for a lightweight rifle like that. Now, in overall pressure profile or velocity, do we actually split the difference between the 45 ACP and the 30-06? Well, at this time, the 45 ACP is moving at about 850 feet per second, and the 30-06 out of the M1 Garand is doing about 2,800 feet per second. So 19, just shy of 2,000 feet per second is kind of splitting the difference between the two pretty handsomely. Now, what are we looking like at energy? I'll go ahead and roll in another chart for our energy comparison here. At 300 yards, we are looking at like 38 special capabilities, which is not terribly special. But at 200 yards, we're actually more like a nice 9mm, maybe 40 Smith & Wesson or 45 ACP, somewhere in there, and a completely acceptable pistol caliber requirement there at 200 yards. All right, so that works out, but we definitely see that between 50 and 100 is kind of a sweet spot for the cartridge, or sub 100 yards is kind of a sweet spot for that cartridge overall. Now, when it comes to overall performance of the cartridge, specifically in warfare, there have been quite a few anecdotal stories related about lethality concerns with the M1 carbine. Let's go ahead and discuss that a little bit more clearly. So a lot of times it's mentioned that the M1 carbine had poor performance in actually stopping an incoming threat. There's a couple of things to take into that account. First off, we're talking about a souped up FMJ pistol bullet. So it's not expanding, and it's not at a velocity that you're getting much of a secondary wound track. So a lot of the velocity aspects of it have already bled off by the time it reaches its target, and you're not getting additional help there. You're not getting fragmentation of the bullet. You're not getting expansion. You're really just looking at whatever it is that a 30 caliber pistol round is able to impact. And in overall tissue destruction or anything along those lines, it's not very helpful. The 30 carbine is actually very indicative of a phenomenon known as ice picking, where it kind of just pokes right through the target and doesn't leave a lot of damage. Now, that doesn't mean that it doesn't necessarily penetrate organs. If you put good shots in, you're still going to split arteries, penetrate organs, and there's a whole lot of things that we could talk about in the overall fight-stopping dynamics of pistol or bullets in general. Switches, timers, all that kind of stuff, not to mention skeletal destruction. But the end state is that you're talking about a very small surface area of actual destruction, which means that it's going to take a little bit longer for somebody to actually stop coming at you, especially since a lot of militaries historically have been utilizing a variety of different stimulants to be able to keep troops going. Now, the United States military uses a little more tame version of tobacco and caffeine for its stimulants, but other militaries haven't necessarily shared that same approach. The Nazis would infuse methamphetamines into a chocolate bar and hand that out to their troops, and there are a wide variety of far worse things than that cited over the years, over the generations of conflict for keeping troops going in the field. So if you have somebody who's on something fairly strong, a fairly strong stimulant, it's gonna take a little bit of effort to stop them. Adrenaline alone can actually work wonders in that same regard. If you take deer hunting into account, specifically bow hunting, yes, broadheads are quite large, and that gives you a greater overall probability for contacting organs or slicing through major blood highways. The end state is that you're still talking about a very small surface area overall being affected. So even if you punch an arrow through a deer's heart, they're still going to run a couple of meters at the least, if not 50 or more. So that's just purely off of adrenaline. That animal's dead. Its brain just hasn't gotten the message yet. And it's the same kind of thing with the M1 carbine in combat. Sure, you shot somebody and they kept coming at you. They're going to die. If you put the shot in the right place, they're going to die. However, the question is, how far do they get before their brain catches up with that realization, and are you still alive at that point? Definitely concern, and understandable one based off of the cartridges that you're working with. Now, obviously, the closer you get with that cartridge, the better that overall performance aspect is going to be. Now, during Korea, there would be a lot of stories related from vets stating that the heavy clothing of the North Korean and Chinese soldiers was stopping the M1 carbine and not allowing, or excuse me, the 30 carbine and not allowing that cartridge to penetrate deep enough to actually affect them. And let's go ahead and analyze that a little bit further. First off, anyone who's testing a cartridge for the military knows that winter exists and that there's a reasonable expectation that combat is going to take place in the winter months. This is not a situation for fair weather fighting. So the bullets used in the military are designed to penetrate, heavy clothing included. And the 30 carbine will penetrate heavy clothing just fine and reach down into the average person's body. That's totally going to happen. A heavy winter coat is not some sort of ad hoc bulletproof vest in this case, even at 200 yards. It's not ideal by any means, but it's still that distance, and we've already looked at the performance index for that cartridge at that distance, but it's still going to punch through that clothing. Now, the thing about clothing is that it has a tendency to come with the bullet whenever the bullet passes through that media, and that is why like FBI testing involves 4 layers of denim whenever ammunition is being tested, so that we can check and see if first off the hollow point gets clogged with material, but then also there's that tearing aspect of the material coming with it. So if you're talking about something that's ice picking already and then it's also dragging additional media with it, there's a pretty good possibility that that additional media is possibly staunching the bleeding. So once again, you put good hits on somebody, they're going to die. The only question is, how long does it take in this case? In heavy clothing, there's a reasonable expectation that it might take a little bit longer. They might be effectively fighting for a couple minutes longer than what you previously thought, but they are eventually going to die. This is not some sort of get out of jail free card just because they threw a parka on. So, that's just some things to consider overall there, and perhaps sometime in the future we'll do a video on actual fight-stopping characteristics in firearms ballistics. Now, let's go ahead and do a little bit of comparison so we can get a better context for the .30 carbine here. I found that the best thing to compare a .30 carbine to is the .357 Magnum, specifically in a rifle type setting. And actually, I'll go ahead and throw up a chart here as well as the velocities, the energy transfer as well. We can see that in this case, 180 grain .357 Magnum does seem to have a lot more, or at least sufficiently more drop than the .30 carbine at distance. However, when we look at energy, generally, the .357 Magnum is putting out just a little bit more energy than the .30 carbine at pretty much every distance. So we can kind of see here that the two cartridges are actually reasonably comparable and make a much better comparison than trying to say that a .30 carbine is more or less a souped up 9mm. In this case, you should actually think of a .30 carbine as like a 30 caliber Magnum. In this case, if we're talking about pistol cartridges, mind you. But that's kind of like, think of it in Magnum terms. If you think about it in .357 Magnum terms, you have a better appreciation for what it is that the .30 carbine cartridge is doing at this point. So that's kind of an interesting aspect overall, and we can draw a couple conclusions from here. So first off, the .30 carbine is effectively a semi-automatic Magnum cartridge, but in addition to that, the .357 Magnum is kind of wasted in a handgun. Now, that's situational, of course. Barrel length, weight of the pistol, and then also the application that you're trying to use it in are going to dictate whether or not the .357 Magnum is a good cartridge for you. And the .357 Magnum is a fine handgun cartridge. It's definitely in an interesting dynamic between like combat Magnums, as far as being on kind of the lighter end of Magnum, but still putting out a lot of fight-stopping energy and characteristics that you would want out of a pistol cartridge. But you throw the .357 Magnum into, say, like a lever-action rifle, and you get a completely different dynamic that is actually pretty positive overall, and something that you should definitely consider if you're looking for a handy little woods gun or home defense type setup. Now, that being the case, what do I consider to be the uses for the .30 carbine? Well, presently, my M1 carbine is sitting in my ready rack as a home defense weapon, and that is specifically because I'm not serving in the United States military in World War II. I have the advantage of being able to select defensive loads, of which some do exist for the .30 carbine. Hornady makes some. I think Carbine makes some, and then there's also even soft point loads out there for the .30 carbine to make it a better overall performer in a self-defense type situation. Before the widespread use of the AR-15, the .30 carbine cartridge and M1 carbine itself were frequently used by police as an up-gun option for stakeouts and stuff like that. So something to consider there. In that regard, make sure you're using hollow point ammunition, because FMJs are definitely going to ice pick, and you're going to potentially run into a what do I normally say? It's self-defense shoot turned murder type situation, potentially, depending on where it is that you live. Now, what about hunting use? Depending on where you are is going to depend on whether or not the .30 carbine that you're trying to use is going to be legal for hunting. In a lot of places in Europe, 30 carbine is going to be marginal at best. Many places in the States, the 30 carbine is illegal to hunt with. The state that I live in now allows any centerfire cartridge for hunting. However, looking at that chart, you're looking at sub 100 yards, possibly sub 50 yard engagements with that cartridge in order to be able to effectively stop a deer-sized animal. So perhaps a really good brush gun, but overall I think it's better used as a varmint type gun. Perhaps a truck cartridge that you keep handy. Hi Max, we're just getting all the animals today. That you keep handy as you move around the farm and do your daily duties. Something along that line. I think the 30 carbine is a great use. Now, my overall conclusions on the 30 carbine is that the US was this close to having an intermediate cartridge. And the unfortunate thing is, instead of shrinking a full-size rifle round into a more manageable cartridge, they souped up a pistol cartridge. And it's definitely a pistol cartridge. We're talking about chamber pressures coming in about 40,000 psi, which 223 556 is coming in around like 55,000 psi roughly. Overall, they kind of missed the boat on intermediate cartridge. But for a purpose-built PDW type setup, personal defense weapon, and a assigned personal defense cartridge, it actually does extremely well. You don't have excessive blast, you don't have excessive recoil, and you don't have excessive muzzle flash. Those are pretty big positives as far as having a purpose-built cartridge is concerned. It's definitely something to keep in mind overall. All right, guys, I think that pretty much covers my thoughts overall on this particular subject. I hope you found this interesting, and have a good day.